How's everybody doing? Today I'm finally getting around to doing the formal review and demo of this 1994 Gibson Les Paul Studio with an Ebony fretboard. So at the beginning of this year I ended up getting a Flying V B2, which I didn't like. I may make a video explaining why I didn't like it, but ultimately I replaced it with this guitar. As you can see, this is not lacking in any sort of sinister vibe, so it's not really a big step away from the B2 as far as the vibe goes, although this one actually I think has a stronger presence. I filmed that intro when there was a ton of super bright light coming in so that you could hopefully see some of the details on this, but in most lighting, like right now, it's kind of like late in the day, sunlight coming in the windows, and I have all the lights on in here. But this is the tone of red, which is wine red, that this guitar normally looks. It normally looks very, very dark. It has to be in like full-on sunlight for you to be able to see through the finish, like in those earlier shots. Of course, that is a normal aging factor where you have nitrocellulose lacquer, which turns amber over time, and then it's turning amber over wine red, so it just becomes even darker. Basically gives this guitar an extremely cool vibe. The one thing about this, as you probably saw in the intro shots, it has a headstock repair. Basically it was split, didn't really lose any material, and it was just sort of replaced in the same shape and position. They didn't try to hide the repair. I don't mind that. Due to that fact, this guitar was listed in fair condition when I got it. As you may have seen in a previous video, I had to change the nut because the nut was extremely low. And I also had to change the neck pickup volume pot when I first got this. The pot was like, the shaft was like seized up, you couldn't turn it at all, and it had no output from the neck pickup. But I replaced that with a 500K DiMarzio pot. Now it works perfectly. I haven't pulled them out to double check, but I'm pretty sure these are the original pickups, which would be a 490 and 498 Gibson pickups. I say that because the tarnishing on the pickups, going from gold to then exposing the sort of nickel colored underneath, matches the bridge and tailpiece exactly. I'd be really surprised if these pickups had ever been changed. They also sound like 490 and 498. So really when I got this thing at first, I could tell it had a crazy amount of vibe, which is why I even bought it off the listing. I could just, looking at the pictures of it, it looked so dark and like sinister looking. I was like, wow, that is sick. But it wasn't really all that playable because you couldn't use the neck pickup and the nut was way too low. So there was some buzz sort of low down. Now the nut's replaced. Everything electronically is working perfectly. This guitar actually plays great. I lowered the action just today. It sounds killer, just like any Les Paul with 490 series pickups. The intro sort of playing was recorded on my Mesa triple rectifier, so it sounded pretty beefy, but basically that's what any Les Paul sounds like through that amp. So definitely sounds good, plays good now. As you can see, the back of the neck has some finish actually worn off where the previous owner had played it, just to the point where it wore through the lacquer and you can see the wood there. There's some finish checking on here. Some of it is hard to come across on camera. There's some around the headstock, which you may have seen on camera, and then around the cutaway there's some finish checking, and then on the back around this sort of waist carve of it right here, there is some more finish checking, but that's just natural aging. It was clear to me when I got this that the first owner really, really loved it because A, they wore the finish off the back of the neck, which takes a lot. There's arm wear right here where you can see the maple top exposed, and they broke the headstock and then they paid to get it fixed. They didn't just say, well, screw this, I'll just throw it out. in the 90s, some of these Les Paul Studios were kind of sought after because they would put an Ebony fretboard on a studio. And they've done that rarely, usually on special models. Like my Les Paul Platinum is technically a studio spec model, but it has an Ebony board. This has an Ebony board, but it was pretty common through the early and mid 90s. It feels great, plays great, it looks good. It has that more sort of like thicker, sort of gruff fretboard tone, if that makes any sense. Obviously the tuners have been replaced probably when the headstock break happened. You can see that because it has the holes above the Grovers, that it probably had the sort of Keystone style Gibson Deluxe tuners. But there's nothing wrong with Grovers. Really, on this instrument, it's like, despite the fact that these are chrome and they don't match the gold hardware, the fact that the hardware is so faded anyway, you could probably have put either chrome or gold on there and it wouldn't even matter. Another slightly weird spec about these 90s ones is that this guitar, for example, has a 3-piece top, which today you only ever really see 2 on a studio, and a 1-piece back, which is odd. In most lighting, you can't really see the seam lines of the top very well, but they are basically in pretty much perfect thirds. You could see it in the intro, but you probably can't see it in this sort of average lighting that we have here. This, because of its overall vibe, and now that it's fully working, I would say this is probably one of my favorite guitars that I've ever owned. Nothing is really like it. The neck profile I would describe as rounded, somewhere between a 50s and a 60s neck as far as size. I think because of the age and how much this guitar has been played, it has a very sort of antique feel to it, even though it's only from the 90s. You could possibly see from some of the close-ups that the lacquer is like completely worn off along the fretboard, although you don't really feel that when you're playing. It just feels like it's more out of the way. Like the corner of the fretboard is more out of the way from scraping your hand all the time. But it does that thing where, because it's a lacquer finish and it's so old and it's been played so much, it almost feels like grippy in places, like along the neck sometimes. Unless you start like sweating on it, then it gets pretty smooth again. But like if you grab it around sort of like the side of it here, wherever you're grabbing it, it will become like grippy, which is funny because that's kind of how a vintage guitar feels. But it's funny because when you actually play this, it plays sounds and functions just like a modern Les Paul Studio. I mean, it's heavy, but it performs just how you'd expect any Les Paul to perform, but it feels vintage even though it's a 94. Really cool guitar. The only reason that I don't play this all the time is because wine red is really not my thing. And because of that fact, even though I think this is one of the coolest guitars that I've ever owned, I don't think that its fate is to stay with me forever. I think its fate is going to be moving along to somebody who appreciates it more than I do. Because really, I mean, hearing this thing, playing it, especially with the new nut, this is a great playing guitar. I can totally see why the previous owner loved it so much, wore it out, fixed the headstock when it broke, all that. So hopefully that has been a good sort of overview, review, demo of my 1994 Gibson Les Paul Studio with the ebony fretboard, wine red, headstock repaired, badass vibes, sinister looking, just sick Les Paul. I really do love this guitar. It's gonna suck to pass it along, but it sucks to have a guitar that's at this point plays so well that I'm not playing. You know, it's kind of a shame. If you like this video, don't forget to share it, subscribe, turn on notifications, and I will see you guys next time.